All right, moving on into Faust here. This, by the way, is the edition that I'm using, the Norton Critical Edition with a translation by Walter Arndt, and it's edited by Cyrus Hamlin. And the key thing about this translation is that it retains the verse. There are prose translations, but I think a prose translation misses the point. You have to capture, at least as best as you can in translation. I realize poetry doesn't translate very well from one language to another, especially from German to English, but this translator has done an excellent job of retaining Goethe's rhymes and the sort of lilting musical quality of his verse. And then the editor has done an excellent job with his interpretive notes. He has a line-by-line commentary in the back that is actually very illuminating. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, but this one is pretty good. And it has some critical apparatus in the back. I'm going to start, by looking at Goethe's life, just to situate this in context. There is a chronology in the back of the book. Here's a picture of Goethe. One of my favorites done by Tischbein from when he was in his late 30s on his Italian journey. He went down to Italy to study plants there and also to study art. He was absolutely fascinated and enraptured by classical sculpture. And indeed, as Rudolf Steiner points out, he had been a Greek sculptor in the 5th century Athens in a past life. So he has a very strong draw to the classical world. And then we have, so his dates are 1749 to 1832. He publishes Faust Part 1 in 1808, 3 years after the death of his friend Schiller, who had been reading all the drafts of it all along. And then finally in 1832, the year of his death, a few months before his death, he completed Part 2 and sealed it up in an envelope not to be published until he was dead. And he died on March 22nd, and then a few months later it was brought out posthumously by a publisher. And it really is Part 2 that is the bomb. As far as I'm concerned, that's what makes this work so incredibly great, is Part 2, which is very hard to read and very difficult to understand, but we'll go through it scene by scene and sometimes line by line. So he's born on August 28th in Frankfurt am Main. Now, as he's growing up here in the 1750s, he became aware of the Faust legend through observing puppet plays, in market squares and wherever they were put on. And I did watch a YouTube puppet play of Faust that is authentically German. It followed a German original script translated into English. So that gave me a sense of how charming and naive these plays were and must have been to the young Goethe, but it planted the seed in his imagination for what later becomes Faust. In 1765, he goes into the University of Leipzig, where he majors not, as you would think, in languages or in literature, but in law, which is somewhat of a surprise and sounds very boring to me. And he was a frequent visitor at Auerbach's Cellar, which is a real tavern that both Mephistopheles and Faust go visit, and that the historical Faust was said to frequent. There's even a mural on the wall depicting him in a couple of adventures. So Goethe used to hang out there. He was probably glancing at the murals as well for more inspiration. And then along about 1768, when he's about 19, he starts planning it out, a drama of the legend of Dr. Faustus. And then he meets Herder in 1770, starts studying Shakespeare. And then in 1772 and 73, he has his first creative explosion. Although it's important to note that in 1772, on January 14th, Susanna Margareta Brandt is executed in Frankfurt for infanticide, and that becomes the inspiration for Gretchen in Faust. Then he served for a while at the Imperial Court in Wetzlar, which is used as the setting for his novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, and then he starts working on 3 projects simultaneously that come out between 1772 and 1775-ish. He starts working on the earliest version of Faust, what's known as the Faust, which contains the earliest scenes and the most bare bones, stripped down storyline. Sometimes you can find it translated separately. And then his first great play, Götz von Berlichingen, which is kind of reads like Shakespeare on fast forward. He's now following Lessing's model, as we discussed in my video on Lessing, in his Hamburger Dramaturgy, where he says we need to follow the models of Shakespeare, not the models of the bloodless, passionless models of tragedy of the French, of Racine and Corneille and Molière. We need to follow Shakespeare, and this is what his first attempt at it. And it's a very good play. And The Sorrows of Young Werther, he has I wouldn't call it exactly a love affair because I don't think it was consummated, but he has an infatuation with a woman that goes bad. He might have been thinking about suicide because Werther rhymes with Goethe, and so he writes a novel in which the same thing happens to this character who does indeed commit suicide. So I think it was cathartic for Gerta, but it was a bestseller. And it was so popular indeed that young men were copying the dress of Werther, who was said to wear a yellow coat. And so there was a yellow coat fad that was going on. And I believe some individuals did commit suicide also following the model. And then so he's got the first version of Faust, which is put into manuscript form in 1776, where it's prepared by one Louise von Gerhausen. He writes, let's see, now in November of 1775, he moves to Weimar. This is a very important thing. He moves to Weimar to enter the service of Duke Karl August in running the state. And essentially, Goethe runs Weimar for a while, at least 10 years, maybe longer. And so it's interesting that he takes up a political office because he's carrying out all the Duke's decisions. And what Goethe says goes in that town because it comes backed by the Duke's authority behind it. So this man was very good at a lot of diverse things and very concrete worldly things, as well as very transcendent otherworldly ideas. He writes a few more plays, and then his great novel, one of the great novels, Wilhelm Meister, is written in 1780 to 86. Volume 1 of it, anyways, the first part. And then he writes a sequel later on. Then in his late 30s, 1786 to 88, he goes on his Italian journey. We see him here on that journey. And then he writes about it. He examines plants, and he comes back. And in 1790, writes the great Metamorphosis of Plants that I discussed in my video on the philosophical idealism of Goethe. So you can look that up. Then from 1791 to 1817, he served as the theater director in Weimar. So he was a director of the theater. He acted in a few of the plays. So he knows how plays are done backwards and forwards. So he knows the mechanics of that world very well, as the Prelude in the theater here to Faust, we'll get to in a minute, demonstrates. And then he has a friendship with Schiller. He meets Schiller, who's 10 years younger than him, in 1794. And it lasts through 1805 when Schiller dies in his 50s. And then he writes the sequel in 1795 to Wilhelm Meister, a short epic, Hermann und Dorothea, in 1797. And then in 1797, he returns back to Faust and starts in again. And the dedication, as we'll see in a moment, dates from this period where he's returning to Faust after being away from it for 15 years and starts working on finishing part 1 and getting it ready for publication. And at the same time, he's already working on part 2 and writes the so-called first draft for the Helena, which is in part 2, Act 5 of part 2. Schiller dies, as we have said, on May 9th of 1805, and then he puts out Faust Part 1, published in his collected works in 1808. Then he writes this beautiful novel, one of my favorites of his, in 1809, called Elective Affinities, which is a short and beautiful novel about two couples who cross each other, and the discordant rhythms of the blood ends up producing a child that is doomed because it's produced by the wrong two parents. So it's kind of a tragic novel. And then in 1810, he creates his color theory. All along, he's been studying the sciences, working on them. He's discovered the intermaxillary bone in humans, working on theories about geology, meteorology, botany, comparative anatomy, you name it. He writes his first version of his autobiography, 1811 to 1814 here. And I want you to notice here that the diversity of this man. He was an absolute master and produced an exemplary example in every known literary genre that was active at his time. He writes masterful short stories like The Beautiful Snake and the Green Lily that Rudolf Steiner was so fond of. He writes novels. Wilhelm Meister is one of the greatest novels ever written. He writes epics. He writes plays, lyrical poetry, an autobiography, nonfiction as well as fiction, literary criticism, and scientific writings. The dude was just a phenomenon. He was good at everything that had anything to do with the mind whatsoever, and a complete master of all literary media of his time. We've not seen a phenomenon like this since. And then, so he continues with his studies and scientific writings for the rest of his life. A few more masterful publications, such as the novella, which he writes in 1828, which is excellent. And then finally dies on March 22nd, 1832. And then Faust Part 2 is published by Eckermann and Riemer as the first posthumous volume of the collected works. And so that gives you his life, puts everything in context so you can see the mighty achievements of this man. But now, before we get into Faust proper, what I would like to do is to discuss Marlowe's Faust. So here we have one of the title pages of it, The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. And it dates from about 1588 or 89 or 90. Scholars are not sure which, but it's right in that orb, right in there. And it wasn't performed until after his death. And so remember that the original German Faust book, the earliest written version of Faust, dates from 1587, and it was published by Johann Spies in 1587, and it is based on a manuscript. So remember that this is also the period in the 16th century of the transition from manuscript culture to print culture, and that is still going on. There was a long, slow process, about a 2 centuries long process of learning to adjust from the oral traditions and the written manuscript traditions to the world of what McLuhan calls the Gutenberg galaxy. And Faust is produced as a printed text. The earliest version is printed there, except for the manuscript. I'm not sure if we still have that original manuscript or not. It may be lost. And then so the original the book is kind of just a novel that's loosely plotted with a lot of random adventures of Faust. It starts off with him just going out into the forest and drawing a circle at a crossroads and bringing Mephistopheles into being, and then making a contract with him for 24 years of power. First, and in every one of these versions, erotic power. Faust wants to get laid. In all of these versions, he's a rather isolated, hermit, introverted type who's sick of it and now wants to experience the female body and its pleasures. And so what happens both in Marlowe and with Marlowe, what Marlowe does is he has him opening up like Goethe's Faust, and Goethe borrows this scene from him where it begins with a sigh, where he's fed up with philosophy, with law, with medicine, and with theology. And now he resorts to magic and then goes out and creates the magic circle in Marlowe's version now, creates the magic circle and invokes Mephistopheles, makes the deal. And he says, I want a wife. And Mephistopheles said, a wife is not such a good idea because she'll henpeck you. You'll always be frustrated, worried about money. I got a better idea. I'll just send you a different girl every morning. Sounds like a good deal to me. So it always starts with the erotic adventure. Faust wants to come down to earth and enjoy the pleasures of the senses, enjoy sex, enjoy the female sex. And so what Goethe does is he takes this idea of Faust lasciviously having this power over all the women in the town to just one girl, Gretchen, narrowing it down like a great artist would, and focusing on one girl, and Faust corrupting her, having sex with her, begetting a child on her, and then ditching her, dumping her. And she kills the child and winds up in jail at the end. And that's the story of part 1, but it's only the first foray of Faust into the physical world now. The other half of the deal is Mephistopheles giving him ultimate power over all the kingdoms of the world. And so the second half, part 2, Goethe's half, has to do with Faust interacting as a statesman with the emperor, which is originally in Marlowe and in the Faust book, the Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, where he goes in Marlowe. First he goes to visit the Pope, after presumably having sex with all these women. He goes then to visit the Pope as an invisible man, plays tricks on him while the Pope's trying to drink, and he steals the drink from him, which is clearly a Protestant dig at the Catholic world. So he plays these infantile jokes on the Pope, then zips over to Charles V, who wants him to bring up the shade of Alexander the Great and his paramour, which he does. He conjures them forth. Then later in the play, a couple of scholars want him to pull up the shade of Helen of Troy so they can see how beautiful she really was. So he does this, and Goethe changes this to making the emperor non-specific, a generic emperor, a good choice, and they go and visit him, and they pull up the shades of Helen of Troy and Paris. So he drops the Alexander motif and pulls them up, and they're kind of like movie stars as they appear before the emperor's court. And then the scope gets wider and wider as Faust introduces paper currency into the kingdom, and we see how it actually causes a destabilization in the economy of the kingdom. And then it moves on from there to battles and Mephistopheles creating an army of empty sort of robot soldiers with iron suits that are marching without men in them. All these wonderful things, and it just gets larger and larger and larger, the whole compass of it, as Faust uses Mephistopheles to give him whatever he wants. And Mephistopheles is amoral then, as technology is amoral. But the moral consequences of whatever it is that technology makes possible devolve back on Faust. They redound onto him, and he has to deal with the moral consequences of this. Okay, so that's the myth as Marlowe transmits it from the Faust book, which he got hold of. And it's very, I do have to put a point in here, wondering about John Dee. Because now John Dee was a kind of magus, a Faust figure for Queen Elizabeth in the Elizabethan court in the time of Shakespeare and Marlowe. And Marlowe would very well have known about him and probably had him in mind. And I can't imagine, although the play was not performed until after Marlowe's death, I can't imagine the audiences who watched it would not have thought of John Dee, who in the 1550s had cast a horoscope which had correctly forecast the exact date when Elizabeth would be crowned Queen of England. And so that took place, and she realized this guy knows his shit. So she pulled him into court. He was the astrologer, necromancer, interested in magic and the occult, as well as the sciences. He was the first to use the phrase the British Empire, and wrote books on seagoing and navigation that were very useful in a pragmatic sense. He was a huge mega celebrity, probably the most famous thinking man or thinker on both the continent as well as England, from about 1550 all the way down to his death in 1608. Although in the time that Marlowe was writing this play in 1588-89, Dee was just returning from a continental foray in Poland, where he'd gone with his wife and Kelly, the magician and medium that he was using to do experiments and talking with spirits, and Kelly's wife. And they were doing all kinds of pornographic things, trading their wives, having foursomes, and having a good time, until Dee, or rather, Kelly did not pull out. So he got Dee's wife pregnant, and that ended the fun, and that caused a whole ruckus between the two couples, and I think ended their relationship. So when Dee and his wife went back to the continent, they were not in favor anymore. Dee was not. And Elizabeth gave him a cold shoulder and set him up well away from the palace, and he was past his prime. But I am positive that Marlowe would have had him in mind as a kind of Faust figure when he was writing his version of the Faust myth, Dr. Faustus. All right, so then we come to Gerta, and let's begin. Let's sort of dig in to the text proper. I want to go over in this video, in the time remaining, the dedication and the prelude at the theater. Now, as it opens up, he has written a dedication, which is a kind of disguised invocation of the Muses, in 1797, when he's almost 50. In 99, he'll be 50. But he hasn't been working on Faust for the past 15 years, and so he sits down to write this dedication, and he's full of nostalgia. And he says, I'll read the first verse here. It says, "Once more you near me, wavering apparitions, that early showed before the turbid gaze. Will now I seek to grant you definition, my heart essay again the former days? You press me. Well, I yield to your petition, as all around you rise from mist and haze. What wafts about your train with magic glamour is quickening my breast to youthful tremor." And then the second verse, "You conjure up delightful days and places, and there ascends so many a cherished shade, like an old legend's half-forgotten graces. First loves and friendships' echoes are replayed. Old grief revives, a mournful plaint retraces life's labyrinthine and erratic gait, and names the dear ones who, by fortune cheated of blissful hours, before me have retreated." And so he's getting very nostalgic because he's been working on the epic for his entire life, ever since he was in his early 20s, and so it brings all this back. But now, in a certain sense, from a Jungian point of view, we could say that It's a disguised invocation to the muses because he moves his ego out of the way and he says, very well then, characters come back. The autonomous complexes of the unconscious, as Jung would put it, come up now, and he's inviting them to dictate the rest of the story to him now. So the ego has moved out of the way, and the autonomous contents are coming out, and so it is a kind of disguised invocation to the muses here, this dedication. So that's the significance of it. Then next year, in 1798, he writes this next little nugget here, the Prelude in the Theater, where he has a theater director, and remember that he was a director of the theater in Weimar, and here's an image of the three of them, with the director and the poet is an alter ego, I think, for Goethe's perspective here, and what's translated as a merry person. I've also seen it translated as an actor or a jester, and you can see the three of them here in this image with the merry person on the left, and the poet sitting down in a very Goethean posture, and then the theater director over here. And so the theater director begins, and what he says basically is, I want to make a lot of money and do a big special effects extravaganza that will cater to the masses and bring them in. And later he describes all the masses coming in, fat, gross, overweight, gluttonous people coming in, crowding in, buying tickets, this rude mob that he wants to cater to, the lowest common denominator. And then the poet responds in terms of, no, I want this to be of artistic integrity. I want to write something here that will be from the depths, that will illuminate people's minds. And so we have here, note that we have this theme of art versus commerce that Goethe is well aware of, that goes all the way down into Hollywood, especially the new Hollywood of the 60s and 70s. And Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola is a classic example of this, as is Martin Scorsese, where the producers want you to make money, the studios want you to make money, but yet you want to be a great filmmaker. And sometimes there's a compromise there. And if you make a film that you want to make that's of artistic integrity and it doesn't make money, you're going to have trouble getting financing for your next picture, which is a problem that has plagued, for instance, David Cronenberg all of his life. His pictures didn't make much money, except for when he did do kind of a sellout to Hollywood with The Fly and The Dead Zone. Those two films grossed a decent amount of money. But the other films did not, and he had more and more trouble getting financing, and he finally just gave up. So that's the problem. And Goethe is already here, well aware, in 1798 of this tension between art and commerce, and they had the same tension here with the plays. And then so the merry person, the actor, I think, the jester, says, well, I just hope there's a good part in it for me. He wants his ego to be magnified. You know, it's the star syndrome. And Goethe's Faust contains so much in it that is prescient of what then follows and unfolds through the media history of the 20th century that it's amazing. He has Faust resurrect for the court the shades of Helen of Troy in Paris. And he's already foreseeing the coming of cinema here as they step on stage like movie stars in front of this audience that reveres and worships them. And he sees the cult of the movie star coming into being, as well as all of these other things, housing developments and the coming of suburbs, what that will entail, how introducing a new paper currency can destabilize an economy. Very prescient. There's not a single form that came into being after Goethe. He even has something to say about genetic engineering as well, with the idea of Wagner creating a homunculus and certain implications that go along with that, which he examines in part 2. This man was very, very prescient. So we'll see this unfold through what I regard as an epic. It's very difficult to regard it as just a play because it really does transcend the bounds of a typical play. It is quite a massive achievement. All right, and so we'll leave it there for this video, and then next time we'll start with the play directly with Faust in his study, alone and brooding.